Hi everyone. In this video lecture, we'll be discussing about how to read files in JavaScript using the file application program interfaces. So there are three things that you have to understand. If you're using a single file, that means an individual file. So each file will be having their own properties like its name, its file size, its MIME type. That means how this file is being transferred through internet, in which type it is being transferred, etc. If we are drag and dropping a folder of files, then we'll have to handle the files in terms of file list because that folder consists of multiple files and all those files must be handled. So in that case, we'll be using file list instead of a single file. We'll be using a file list. Okay, and then there's something known as blob. Blob is used for slicing a file into byte ranges. That is, into several bytes. We can divide or split the entire file into different bytes. Now how to input a file. Okay, so the most straightforward way to load a file is to use the standard input type equal to file element. We know this input element before. We have seen this when we have declared or when we have designed buttons. In that case, the type attribute was given as button. In this case, if you're trying to input a file, then we have to mention the type attribute as file. In this case, we are loading only a single file. Okay, if we are mentioning the attribute value as multiple, that we will see in the upcoming sessions, in that case, we will be able to load multiple files at the same time. So if we are So in this case, JavaScript returns list of selected file objects as a file list. Okay. So if you are loading multiple files, then details of all those files will be returned as an object of file list. Now each file or each file element inside or each instance of the file inside the file list will have these properties. Its name. So a file object is actually, it gives the information only. It does not provide any access towards a file. Okay, so if you're using input type equal to file, we'll be able to load a file, but we'll not be able to access the contents inside the file. Okay, so that you have to remember, a file object is actually a reference to a file. It's only a reference. Getting data from that file is completely another process. We had to do something else in order to get data from that file. So how to get a file reference? How we can load a file into our JavaScript into a web page? When we use input type equal to file, this is actually a control. We are actually giving the web page the permission to access that file. Okay, so first thing we have to do is, if you want to access or if you want to play with files in web pages, the first thing we have to do is to mention this control, input type equal to file. Once this is mentioned, that means we can load files into a web page. Okay, now in HTML5, it defines a file's property for all input type file controls. Okay, for all this input type equal to file controls, HTML5 provides a file property, and that is the file list. And file list is nothing but an array like structure. Okay, and this array like structure will be containing all the file objects or file instances that we have uploaded. So this is an example for how to handle files. See here, input type equal to file, that's our control, and I have given one ID. ID is used for uniquely identifying this control. Then see, this is a property that I was talking about. If you are mentioning like multiple, then we can load multiple files into our web page. Like we can select multiple files and we can drag and drop a folder of files in. That means multiple files can be loaded at the same time if this is mentioned. If we are not mentioning this word here, we'll be able to load only a single file. And see how we are writing at this. We have written one script. Okay. Inside the script, I have used one control variable and I am obtaining the control of this input type file by using the ID. See this document.getElement by ID your files. So here this your files is the ID given to this input type. So I'm gaining the control of this I'm gaining the access or control over this input type file by using this document.getElement by ID. So now this variable control refers to this portion of the web page. So once we have written this line in the web page in our code, this portion will be used for loading the files. When we drag and drop a file over here, this portion will accept that file. And see, so now this variable control is a link to this area of the web page. And see what I have done, control.add event listener. I have added an event listener. And what is that event listener? Change. Whenever a change occurs over here, over this portion of the web page, I'm actually adding an event listener and I have added a function over here. So when the control has changed, that means something has occurred over here. That means we have loaded some files. So when does the control when does an event occurs in this area? An event occurs only when we load a file into this area. So a change occurs only whenever a change occurs here, that means we have loaded some files into this area. So now we are going to access that file. That's what we mean by this comment here. When the control has changed, that means some files are added to this portion of the web page. Now we are going to access the files. I've declared on the variable I equals 0, then files equal to control.files. What is control? Control is actually a reference point to this element whose ID is your files, which is this one. So when the files are uploaded here, we're actually accessing those files but like this control.files, and that is stored into this variable files. So there can be multiple files drag and dropped to this portion. So I'm finding out the length, that means how many files I have drag and dropped or how many files I have selected. So for that, len is equal to files.length. Files is this variable. So files.length will give us the number of files selected. And I'm using a for loop and I'm accessing each file's name, type and size. Suppose we have 5 files, then I will be starting from 0. It will go up to 4. 0, 1, 2, 3 and 4. That means 5 elements. Each file's name, type and size will be displayed. That is what this example means. Try to implement this example, then it will be more clear. And see here the command is console.log. That means this will be printed in our console, not on the web page, not on the web browser. It will be printed only in the console. That's what we have written here, console.log. How to drag and drop files. In order to read files that are dropped onto an area of the page, we must listen for the drag over and drop events. That is, we often see that we can drag and drop files or even folders into the web page, some web pages, especially in Gmail and all. We are able to drag and drop files when we send emails, etc. If that has to be made possible, then we must listen to that event. This drag and drop is actually an event. So if we are able to handle those events, then we can access the files. So that's what we mean here. If you want to read files that are drag and dropped onto the website, then we must listen to those events. That is drag over and drop events. That is what we are going to do next. In this example, see what we have done. I have created one div its IDs your files. Then I have linked a variable to that ID or that div by this document.getElement by ID your files. Then I have that variable is target, and to that variable I have added an event listener, not a single one. I have added two event listeners. One is drag over and one is drop. So whenever drag over event occurs, this event listener will work. Whenever drop event occurs, this event listener will work. So when drag over occurs, I have called one function, and this function prevents all the default actions of this drag over event. Similarly, this function prevents all the default actions of this drop event. And then what we have done is similar to the previous example. I've declared one variable I as 0, then files equal to event.data_transfer.files. This is another way of accessing files. Event.data_transfer.files. This is another kind of accessing files. What is event? See, this line is written inside this function. This function. This function is actually mentioned in the event listener of drop. So whenever something is dropped into that area, which area? Into this div, because target is now linked to this div. So whenever some files are dropped into this area, okay, this event means that drop event. Okay, so event.prevent default means all the default actions that takes place when a drop event occurs that we are cancelling here by calling this prevent default function. This is a built-in function. And event.data_transfer.files means event is this drop event, and from that we are actually accessing the files that's been dropped into that area. Then len equal to files.length, similar to the previous example. We are displaying the file name, type and size of all the files we have drag and dropped into this area. In the previous example, we were not able to drag and drop. If you try to implement that, you will be able to understand we are not able to drag and drop files into that area. We'll have to browse and upload the file. In this example, we can drag and drop even a folder to that area. That's the difference between this example and the previous example. Again, one thing you have to remember, the output will not be displayed on the browser. It will be displayed only on the console. So you have to go to console. I hope you know the key that we have to press to see the console. Now we have loaded the file. Now you want to access the contents inside the file. To access the data inside the file, you have to use file reader type. Okay, so this file reader type has only a single job, that is to read data from a file and store it in a JavaScript variable. And this file reader type reads data from the file asynchronously. That means the browser does not need to wait for this file reader type. Also, this file reader can read files in different formats. It can read as a string, as a byte, or as URI. There are different versions or different types in which this file reader can read the files. So we have to mention in which way we have to read the file. This is what I told you. Reading is done through calling one of these methods. We can use any of these methods to read data from the file. If we want to read the data as a text, we have to call this method. If we want to read the data as a binary string, we have to use this method. If it is an array buffer, we have to use this method. If we want to read data as a URI or URL, we have to use this method. This method is often useful when we have to read content such as an image located in a hard disk. So we need to get the path. We need to get the URL. So in such cases, we have to use this method. So each of those methods we have seen so far initiates a file read. We must listen for the load event before we start to read. So a file can be read only if it is loaded. So we must listen to the load event. Once the load event is successful, we can read the files. If the load event is an error, then it's not possible to read the files. So the result of read, so once we have read some content from the files, all those content will be stored, or it will be represented by this event.target.result. This is an example. I am creating a new file reader because this is what we are going to use for reading the data from the files. So now it is a reader. Then reader.onload. That means once a file is loaded successfully, we have to do the following things. Reader.onload function event, then var contents equal to event.target.result. So always remember, once this reader completes the reading of contents from a file, it will be stored in something known as event.target.result. We have to copy the content from this event.target.result to a variable that is contents. Now we are going to display that contents. Again, I'm using console to display the content here. So console.log file contents plus contents. So now the contents variable contain all the data read from the file and it will be displayed in the console. If that there was an error, then we have to mention that also. So reader.onError function event, we have to mention the error. We have to display the error on the console. So we have to do like this. See how I have to read the file. I have to mention that reader.read as text file. We are trying to, I want my file to be read as a text. So I have to use the method read as text. So it's explanation of the previous example. Simply reads the contents of file and outputs it in a plain text to the console. The onload handler is called when the file is successfully read, whereas onError handler is called if the file was not read for some reason. So you can scroll back and see we have mentioned reader.onload. That means once the file has been read successfully, it will be mentioned by onload function. If there was an error, it will be mentioned by onError. Then all those things you can read and understand. So another example, the complete example. So head, I mentioned body. Inside the body I have included the control to load a file, input type equal to file, and here I have mentioned multiple. That means I can load or I can upload multiple files at the same time. Then I have created an ID for this section of the web page, that is your files. Then inside the script I am accessing this element of the HTML page by using its ID. So document.getElement by ID your files. So now control is actually getting the control over the element whose ID is your files. So that is basically this one. Then see, I am adding the event listener of change. Whenever something occurs in this area of the web page, I am adding an event listener. What is that event listener? This is function event. That is, I am creating a new file reader, so that I can read the files, contents from the files that is being loaded into this area. So file is equal to event.target.files of 0. Okay, so here if there are multiple files, it will be a file list. So inside that file list I need to access the first file, so that is why I mentioned files of 0 here. So that will be pointed by this variable file. Now I want to read the content inside the file as a text. So reader.read as text, which file I have to read, that is being stored inside this variable file. So I am giving that as the parameter. Okay. Now onload event, that's what we have to mention here, reader.onload. So reader is actually a file reader. When the file is read successfully, this onload will work properly. If there was an error, then reader.onError will be working properly. So the file is read or is properly. If the file reading is completed properly, then we can call this function, and we know that the data that is being read by the file reader will be stored inside event.task.result. I am copying that contents into a variable named contents, and I am displaying that contents in the console. And if there was an error, I am displaying that error also. So this is a complete example for reading files. You can implement this and see the results. That is all in this video. Thank you so much.